Hello, everyone, and in this lecture, we will be talking about Frankenstein once more. Now, in the previous lecture, we have covered the issue of Victor Frankenstein's creation of the monster as an abominable being and Mary Shelley's parallels, which she draws from Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, in this lecture, we will be going into something else. We could have talked about that in more detail, but the biblical parallel can wait because we have a limited time to finish this text. Now, when we are talking about Frankenstein, we must realize that Frankenstein is in effect man's attempt to create another man. That is man's role of playing God. In this regard, we must take into consideration the fact that Frankenstein was a text which was influenced to a great deal by the Enlightenment philosophies and the Enlightenment theories. Therefore, we cannot simply deny that aspect. Now, as early as the 18th century, Alexander Pope had said that know thyself and presume not God to scan, a proper study of mankind is man. So Pope set the discourse, he altered the area of vision from God to man. Now, if man alters his vision from God to man, then man's role becomes that of a perceiver. But what if this role of a perceiver takes a superior position? What happens then? Uh, there is a quotation from the text where Victor Frankenstein says, I began the creation of a human being. Now, in his 1797 essay of an early taste for reading, William Godwin had already announced the fact that literature, taken in all its bearings, forms the grand line of demarcation between the human and the animal kingdoms. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, which is dedicated to William Godwin and Caleb Williams and etc., may be read as a critique of this pronouncement. Now, Shelley's indeterminate but uh, decidedly literate monster asks us to consider whether literature taken in all its bearings was indeed a useful line of demarcation between the human and the animal. Now, the fate of the monsters suggests that proficiency in the art of language, as Godwin called, may not ensure one's position in the human kingdom. That is, Mary Shelley raises the question that is, how do we perceive an animal? Now, if you look even at the beginning of the human history, the animal served a dual role. That is, the perception of the animal served a dual role. And what were these roles? First of all, the animal was something which was distant from the human, because human beings usually, the early human beings, usually did not interact that much with the animals apart from the hunting, or they avoided those animals. And the animal was something of an unchannelized potential a potential representative of nature itself, which the human beings could not control. And of all the animals, only human beings need tools, unnaturally made tools to hunt another animal or dominate another animal. Even many of us have dogs in the family. Even till today, we need a leash. We need a leash to walk them. So, the very control over the animal kingdom for human beings has always been based on tools. And Shelley, that is Mary Shelley, shows us how a literary education, which was so crucial to Godwin's sense of perfectibility, presupposes not merely an educable subject, but a human being. Now, read through Godwin's dictum, the trajectory of Frankenstein's creation offers a parable of a pedagogic failure, specifically a failure in the promise offered by the humanities, that is, the letters which serve as a route to humanization. Now, in assuming language and literature as domains which are available to mankind, or to, in this case, to the monster itself, the monster still succumbs to the ruse of the humanities. And the belief that intellectual and literary refinement, to quote Godwin, might be the route to his humanization. And the novel goes on to demonstrate, perhaps against itself, that the acquisition of a literary refinement fails to humanize the problematics of the body and the ever unnamed monster. Now, the monster thus introduces, and in itself it embodies, an anthropological problem which literature has failed to resolve, at least within the novel. And yet, this problem displays itself by the fact of the novel still being available. That is, the problem still remains, but the remedy is nowhere to be found, at least in the novel. Now, the perfectibility of man meets its violent contradiction in a speaking, reasoning, cognitive being which men, women, and children throughout Europe are unable or unwilling to recognize as a fellow being of the species, of the same species. Now, the meaning of species, therefore, comes into question over here, just like the meaning of the monster. Now, when we talk about a species, the meaning of the word species or the term species is not self evident. And indeed, Mary Shelley retains its suspension throughout the novel. The meaning remains suspended of what do we arrive at when we think of or when we talk about a species. Now, what we will see today is that Victor Frankenstein's final deliberations about the monster's future transform and fix the functional meaning of species. Moreover, it is Victor Frankenstein's uh, introduction of the Malthusian discourse, which allows him to arbitrate, in the last instance, the question of the monster's species itself. Now, therefore, we need to first address the issue of being of the same species. That's how do we define that two beings are of the same species? Imagine a Royal Bengal tiger and a leopard, are they of the same species? How do we know? Or imagine a man from Russia and a man from India. They are physically different, their looks are different, their attitude towards life is different. Are they of the same species? Now, here we have to go through the broad contours of the Malthus Godwin debate. Now, whereas Malthus talks about the principle of population, Godwin talks about the principle of perfectibility. Now, Malthus and Godwin appear as representatives of two very divergent ideas in a historical appropriation of the human understanding of species itself. Now, Godwin's version talked about an unlimited possibility of human improvement, and Godwin's defense of universal benevolence as the criterion of moral action and political justice was absolutely against Malthus. In his essay of Avarice and Profusion, which was published in the Enquirer, Reflections on Education, Manners, and Literature in 1797, Godwin provoked Malthus, and Malthus attacked Godwin to a great deal based on his radicalism and his reliance on Condorcet's theory of mind and his poor relief. In in Malthus's own essay called Essay on the Principle of Population, which was written in 1798. Now, these antagonistic features remained up till almost several decades. And in 1820, Godwin finally published his own Of Population, an inquiry concerning the power of increase in the numbers of mankind, being an answer to Mr. Malthus's essay on that subject. And here Godwin openly talked about his quarrel with Malthus, and he said that such speculation have now been current for nearly 20 years. Now, written towards the end of this 20-year period, Frankenstein therefore should be read in specificity of historical analysis of the Malthus Godwin controversy. Now, the popularity of Godwin himself during Mary Shelley's lifetime was as an antagonist of Malthus, as well as the author of Political Justice and Caleb Williams. And any discussion would about him, about the Godwinian benevolence, would entail the Malthusian critique of it. That is, Malthus talked about the calculus of moral restraint, of misery, of vice, etc. Now, P.B. Shelley, who was a disciple of Godwin and a despiser of Malthus himself, made a connection between the two as his a philosophical view of reform demonstrates. And this debate went on. And why is it so very interesting to us? Because throughout Frankenstein, we can easily see the repetition of such freighted phrases as misery, human benevolence, selfishness, justice, and duty, which indicate a very careful and logical rhetoric of the central problems raised by the Malthus Godwin controversy. That is how to imagine the preconditions, the possibilities and limits of human happiness. Now, Mary Shelley's novel internalizes the broad contours of this debate, and moreover, it talks about the anthropological preconditions of man. Now, what happens over here is that all critics, they agreed with Victor that the monster is a nuisance, is a problem. And how to describe this problem remains a further problematic venture. Now, the structures of his body show that he is not just simply a human problem, but he is also a physiological and aesthetic problem. Now, his fluency points out that it is a problem of eloquence as well, and he is at various moments and often simultaneously a linguistic, a national, a rational, a political, a sexed and sexual problem as well. Now, it is very easy to categorize all the problems that are raised by the monster, but equally difficult is one single ground from which we can address all these issues. And what happens is that what we can notice, what is the commonality between them? The commonality between them is that the monster's monstrous problem emerges in a specific terrain. What is that specific terrain? That specific terrain is the discursive construction of human being. How is a human being constructed? That is the single terrain from which we can address all of these problems. Now, this calls into discussion a major philosopher of the previous century whose name is Michel Foucault, particularly his book, The Order of Things, an archaeology of the human sciences, as well as the archaeology of knowledge and the discourse on language. Now, the monster, which is a product of the natural sciences, becomes a problem for human sciences. And literature fails to resolve that problem for the monster who discovers himself as forever exiled from the human kingdom. And therefore, we must read the novel not only as a technophobic allegory, but also as a critique of the masculinist presumption, a Godwinian fable, and also as a critique of the anthropological and anthropomorphic foundations of what constitutes the categories of human and humanities. Now, the first thing that we notice in the text is that the text causes a rupture in the human world and thus a redoubling in the Derridian sense. Now, what am I talking about over here? Why is it a rupture? Because the monster is human like, humanoid, but not human. And it is this difference that the monster commits, that the monster embodies in itself, causes the rupture. However, since there are two angles of now looking at the monster, from the human's perspective, the monster, and from the monster's perspective, the human, therefore it's a redoubling. So this rupture and redoubling matrix remains there. Now, Robert Walton in Frankenstein says that if what we saw was an optical delusion, It was the most perfect and wonderful recorded in the history of nature. Now, judging by this quotation taken from the text, we at once have to probe into a barrage of questions. That is, what kind of of a being is the monster? What is this body which so desires to humanize itself? Now, Anne Miller writes that Mary Shelley saw the creature as potentially monstrous, but she never suggested that he was other than fully human. Now, we have to intervene over here because the basic problem, Anne Miller found out the problem for us because the monster appears as other than fully human. This seems to be very much the crux of the problem that we are going to face, or rather, we are facing. Now, it is true that Victor Frankenstein's ambition was to create a human being, and possessed of the secret of the cause of generation and life, the young scientist overcomes his hesitations and begins to work. And he says, I began the creation of a human being. Yet immediately Victor turns from this beginning. The particularity and smallness of the human body frustrate him. And he says, as the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic structure. That is, the monster is 8 feet tall. Now, within several paragraphs, we see that Victor is raiding charnel houses and he's gathering bones and body parts. And he further notes that the dissecting room and the slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials. And Victor now dreams that a new species would bless me as its creator and its source. But even if we look this briefly at the creation of the monster, we must realize that Victor is undergoing an unsteady modulation of the vision of human being into the vision of a new species. Now, this physiologically indeterminate being which he creates, this brings us to the threshold of species being, and it unhinges the human. Now, if Victor had retained his original idea of creating a human, these problems perhaps would not have appeared. But since Victor shifted from creating a human being to a new species, and he did not know what he was doing, he just wanted to change the proportions. Now, this alteration causes all the problem and it unhinges the text itself. Now, Victor's labors ultimately become not an experiment to create a human being, but rather an experiment in speciation, an experiment with extremely heterogeneous materials. And violating the ideal bounds of life and death, Victor inadvertently confronts another threshold, which is the boundary between species. He produces a biological anomaly. Also, the production of this anomaly threatens his own human nature, which turns with loathing from his occupation. Now, as soon as the monster convulses into life, Victor defensively remarks on the unhuman features that the monster possesses. Now, perhaps attempting to establish immediately the difference in species, what caused Victor's revulsion was that the creature has been projected not as a different species, but it has been glossed as an aesthetic rejection. It has been glossed as an uh, anthropomorphic rejection, and it has been glossed as a rejection of a mother in her child, of a child at his birth or at her birth. Now, a disgust with childbirth is something that will have to come later. This is also a horror at the violation of a taboo. That is, Victor is traversing in the terrain of a taboo between life and death itself. Now, yet, we can also see that Victor's concern for his own human nature and his specification of the unhuman features of his creature suggest that human being is the species category in question that Victor wanted to create. But then, why the dilemma of creating another species? Now, the rest of the novel, if you look at it, is basically Victor's response to the monster's final state. The rest of the novel. Now, herein we have a debate that whether the monster can be called into the human society, the human civilization as a fellow being, or would the monster always remain inarticulate, demonical as a corpse, as Victor calls him? Now, Victor's experiment thus implicates the human being itself. And in this sense, we have a scene of creation, one of several in which Shelley features the category of human under critique. And the thing originally intended to be a human becomes, in fact, a threat to human nature itself. Now, the monster is not decisively human, nor as his eventual fluency or rationality suggests that he is decisively not human. How do we construct the humanity of the human being? Through our cognition, as we have already mentioned Descartes, through our nature, and the monster possesses it all. The problems arise from there, and the major problem is at once its anthropological, its anthropomorphic significance itself. Now, what happens over here is that Victor inadvertently engineers not a human being, but the monstrous critique of the very category itself. And the riddle of the monster propels a proliferation of categories itself. That is a nominalistic exploration which suggests, in this case at least, a taxonomic breakdown. The body in question expresses no name, which is precisely proper to it. For instance, say I look at a monkey. Now, science has given it a name, a taxonomical name, Macaca mulata. There is another species of monkey which is called uh, Presbyterian entals or something like this. So, like mankind is Homo sapiens, there is another being which possesses, say, another name. So, similarly, science categorizes everything as per its own taxonomy. But specifically, this monster having no name breaks this taxonomical structure. Now, to account for the categorical problem which the monster produces and embodies, it is important that we consider the discourses through which the monster speaks and is spoken about, and the modes of being such discourses imply. Now, Victor's idea based and material construction of the monster, there is a messy work of brain and the hand, As Blake wrote in The Tiger, uh, what the anvil, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? Remember those lines. So, similarly, these lines occur over here as well. The same sense occurs over here as well. So, the basic ideas of the brain and the hand provides us with at least two routes of understanding the monster's being. Yet the novel offers several other modes and means of apprehending the problem of the monster, including the visual and oral perception of it, and the territorial and national forms that the monster takes. Now, these various modes of representation are by no means mutually exclusive. Discourses of human beings multiply as the monster forces the rearticulation and reorganization of the content and mode of understanding the human itself. And Victor relates the sort of conceptual genesis of the monster in terms of his narratological genesis. Robert Walton uh, introduces the first terms through which to speak about the monster as distinctions based on form and territory. And Walton proposes the monster as an optical delusion, a revolution in the history of nature. Now, here I would like to say something about illusion, delusion, and hallucination. Now, there is a story which helps you to understand this very simply. Imagine you enter a room, a dark room, where there is a little dim light coming from the outside, but the room is mostly dark. And there is a rope, okay, a rope lying on the ground. You enter the room and suddenly you think that it's a snake. You think that the rope is a snake. So you run out in fear. And you tell your friends that there is a snake. Now, two or three of your friends go inside and they see that, okay, there is no snake, but that's a rope. They come out and they tell you that, look, it's a rope. You were misguided. And then you enter and you see, okay, this is a rope. Okay, now this is illusion. Illusion can be cured when it is pointed out. What is delusion? Say the same thing has happened. Your friends have come out and they have told you that there is a rope and not a snake. You go back, but still you are seeing the snake. That is delusion. Now, with proper treatment, it can be cured. Now, imagine you have entered the room in the first place and there is no rope, but still you are seeing the snake. That is a hallucination. Okay, so this is a very simple way of understanding the difference between illusion, delusion, and hallucination. So, Walton calls it an optical delusion, a revolution in the history of nature. Now, yet this optical delusion lives and moves and has its own being. And the proliferation of discourses around this rupture in the natural history of human beings, of nature, attempts to kind of represent its all too corporeal rift in the known and the knowable world, in the known and the knowable discourses. And Walton first reports of the sighting of a being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature. Now, this apparition is soon followed by a human being. He was not, as the other travelers seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered land, but an European. Now, to Walton, the first figure, the monster, takes the gigantic aspect, and the second one, soon revealed to be Victor Frankenstein, immediately appears as a fellow human being and precisely a European. Now, this first encounter delineates the kind of perpetual oppositions which govern the logic of territory and species in the text. The most obviously, human beings in Frankenstein are inevitably European, whereas the monster consistently provokes questions such as Walton's: is this unknown vast inhabited by giant, of which the being we saw is a specimen? And the hailing of Victor as a European emerges as a differentiation against a savage backdrop. Now, Walton's very syntax, therefore, is problematic as it performs the negative construction of European being. This Victor was not as the other traveler, he did not seem to be a savage, but he seemed to be a European. And Walton's report therefore introduces questions of seeming and being, of appearance and reality, of essence and existence, and this might allow for an ambiguation of his own categories. Yet, his very facility with which such constructions are created, with all of these facilities, he provides in the embryo the terms and terrain with which the novel will eventually fix and specify the savage as non European and therefore as non human. Now, in such language, Walton introduces one dimension of the anthropological problem of the novel. There is Walton's opposition of the savage giant and the European man soon modulates into a commentary on linguistic and territorial communities. And Walton finds himself addressed in English, although with a foreign accent, and the European then soon becomes a foreigner to the English interlocutor. Now, Walton converses with this figure, who is actually Victor Frankenstein, in his native language, which is French. And the successive translations and the becoming foreign of Victor to Walton's deterritorialized at sea in ice principle points out the problematic conjunction of a fantasized unitary place, Europe, and its multiple linguistic idioms. And the European community includes England and France so far, and will grow to include, as the novel progresses, Geneva, which is Victor's native town, Italy, the site of Elizabeth Lavenza's birth, Germany, where Victor attends university, Holland, where Victor and his friend Henry Clerval tour, and Orkney Isles, where Victor undertakes the creation of a second female creature, and Ireland, where Henry dies. Yet Frankenstein repeatedly suggests that Europe may be a phantom, a spectral place beyond and opposed to the clear boundaries of a nation or a republic, even as the Europeans appear to inhabit, and their spectrality, their spectral contours of this phantasmagoria is in direct opposition to the contradistinction of the savage giant. Now, Europe exists as a category over and against the strong persistence of the native lands and languages, and the European victor is soon denominated as a foreigner by Robert Walton. The turning of a fellow human and European into a specifically Genovese French speaking foreigner shows how humans identify each other through increasingly differentiated and estranging categories. And the monster strains against and defines the limits of these kinds and levels of classification. Now, this sighting, as David Marshall argues, reads as a variation on a Rousseauistic topos, that is, tableau of a primitive man. And what does the tableau of primitive man posit? It posits an isolated natural man or a post diluvian man who would instinctively react with fear whenever he came across another man. Now, in the beginning, or right after the catastrophe, so the hypothesis went, men would not recognize one another as fellow human beings, but would rather perceive the other as a giant, as a mortal threat. Now, common human being was thus imagined as emerging slowly and tortuously only après beaucoup d'expérience. As Rousseau says, that is, after many, many years of experience, that is, civilization created the idea of human. And if you follow Foucault, then Foucault says that we never hear about humanism in the Renaissance. The Renaissance never talked about humanism. It is only after the Enlightenment, it is the late 18th and early 19th centuries, from where the human, the concept of the human itself emerges. And it is this concept of the emerging human that causes all the problems, that problematizes all the things. That is, we talk about humanism so much, but humanism is a product of a proper late Enlightenment philosophy. Now, therefore, such a fiction asserted there was no automatic sympathetic identification among human beings, and sympathy and society were conceived and achieved not natural as aspects of human condition, but after the uh, enlightenment proper, or as civilization growed. Now, Mary Shelley locates this post enlightenment uh, primitive tableau in modern Europe. And the giant thrives and terrifies not in antiquity but in the contested present of the late 18th century Europe. And we can read, therefore, his giganticism as Walton's misprison. He is not really a giant, but rather appears to be so to Walton. Yet, this giganticism is more than a perceptual error or a trope. Victor tells us later that he intended to make an extremely large monster, a being of gigantic stature. And Walton is not wrong to identify the monster as such. The monster is not like Rousseau's hypothetical giants. He is not an optical delusion. He is quite literally a giant with a specific humongous body, a body whose composition and scale were determined under the specific conditions of Victor's workshop. And he is theory embodied and made historical. Therefore, with the coordination of the territorial, the cultural, the linguistic modes of identification and difference, Walton's citing introduces the terms by which a human being might know and speak itself, and more relevant to the monster, a discursive range through which an anomaly might use. So we get two perspectives. One is by which the human speaks of the monster, and another by which the monster humanizes itself. And when the monster gives the account of its own life, it makes clear that it did not understand itself naturally to be excluded from human fellowship. It is only after he has been rejected as a French speaking fellow man that he eventually concludes, as his maker seems to have long before, that there can be no community between the monster and his maker. Now, it takes the monster several years to learn what all sighted beings know about him, that his presence, whether conceived as a giant or a specimen of the giant race, or as a demonical corpse, proves to be an irredeemable rupture in the humanity or in the humanly peopled world itself. What the monster is forced to acknowledge and to learn is that his birth remains a breach, and further, that his literal speech provides no adequate redress for his natal alienation. He is a breach in nature, he is a breach in humanity, he is a breach in the world, he is a breach in territory, he is a breach in population, and he is a breach in every way that we can think of. And therefore, the monster functions as a transgression in the Foucauldian sense, where the monster transgresses the very domains of the human, and by transgressing the domains of the human, the monster makes commentaries on its own humanity and on the human race, which looks at the monster not as a partner but as an other. This otherification of the monster therefore becomes so very significant as a trope to explore that which we call human. Now, with this, I'll end this lecture, and in the next lecture, hope to meet you. So, thank you so much. Have a good day.